Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Michael Gaughan. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Bond Bank. I'm very happy to introduce today Michael Edwards, who is um, the Public Service Director. Do I have that right?
Public Services Manager.
Public Services Manager for the Collins Center at UMass Boston. They are a local government technical assistance entity that Michael will be able to tell us more about in the beginning of his presentation. But Michael comes to the Collins Center after some work in the city of Auburn, Alabama, and has been there since 2020. He's also joined by his colleague, Jen Wisher, who is actually works with the Collins Center, but is based here in Vermont. So with that introduction, I will turn it to Michael. And for those joining, if you have questions, just put them in the chat and I will find a moment to interject into Michael's presentation as we go here. This is also being recorded and will be up on the Bond Bank's website afterwards. Turn it to you, Michael. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. So, Michael, do I have the ability to share a screen? Looks like
yes, you should have that green button below there to share screen.
I've got host disabled, participant screen sharing.
Uh-oh. Let me fix that real quick. Apologies.
That's okay. We got it. We got just a minute.
You are the host now, so you should be good.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate the introduction. As he mentioned, I'm Mike Edwards. I'm out of the Collins Center with UMass Boston. And just a little bit about us. So we were actually created in 2008 to really do nothing but provide technical assistance in a low-cost manner, but effective to towns, state agencies, and really every type of entity across Massachusetts. Over the last few years, we've expanded a little bit of our work into Connecticut, New Hampshire, now getting some opportunities to talk to folks in Vermont. So we do appreciate the opportunity the Bond Bank has given us. But basically, the way that our model works with our center is we've got a handful of people like me that are full-time project managers, analysts like Jen, and then we draw really from a group of associates and subject experts that are retired municipal executives. So finance directors, public works directors, police chiefs, fire chiefs, town administrators. But since 2008, we've done a little over 800 projects. I think we're pushing up right now on about 850. At any given time, we usually have between 100 and 150 projects going at any given time across the state and across New England. And we've actually just hit, I think, actually the 70% mark of the towns in New England or in Massachusetts as far as ones that we've had engagements with. We do a lot of work with mid-sized towns, and lately a lot more work with smaller communities. And up on the screen, you'll see there last year we had both Boston and our smallest community, Gosnold, both active projects at the same time. So we really do provide services across all entity types and sizes. So we're excited to have an opportunity to talk to you about some of the stuff we do in small towns. I do have a nice little graphic. We're trying to fill this map right now, and over the last couple months, a few of those white ones have turned red as well. But these are towns that we've worked with in the state, and we're working on expanding this map to hit Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine, because we don't believe there's any other public sector agency that really does what we do up here, which is really a public service mission-driven operation to provide technical assistance and make towns work a little bit better. So what Michael's asked us to talk about today is capital planning, and in particular capital planning for small towns. So a little bit about Massachusetts. So we're fortunate that we do have a very strong state entity that provides local assistance and really a lot of local administration through the Division of Local Services to municipalities. So we have a very standardized system for data collection, data reporting, and what's unique is really your small towns, your large towns, your big cities are all subject to the same types of standardized data reporting, et cetera. And that's somewhat unique in New England. So what they also do is they push out a lot of best practices that are fairly standardized. And we started noticing a few years ago that you know, the practice of capital planning is very different at the very small town level and very intimidating when they push best practices to that apply really across all municipal sizes. So if you pick up your typical capital planning document for a Massachusetts town or city, you'll see a relatively standard approach. And what we started finding several years ago is we were doing a number of these plans for small towns and then checking back with them after the years go by and find that they really weren't updating them. And mostly that was because we hadn't right-sized the plans for the towns and really recognized the capacity limitations that smaller towns have to process these updates on a regular basis and actually make these a useful guiding document for public communication, for management, for financing. So we step back and really try to look at what were the core elements that smaller towns need when they start approaching capital planning. A lot of reasons to develop a CIP. It is a fair amount of work, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So, you know, the most obvious reason is really just to smooth out your expenditures over time, and in particular, try to see where you can take advantage of, you know, the proper time to replace an asset to minimize your both operating and maintenance and repair costs, but the investment cost and using debt as a tool. Looking at those good replacement schedules and hitting things before you have catastrophic failure. Phasing in of large scale projects. There's a lot of that in Massachusetts in the smaller towns where most of your larger scale projects are funded through debt exclusion referendums. So it's really important that when they're presenting these, that they push the longer picture out to people so they understand this may not be the end of this particular project, and it avoids a lot of issues in the communication side of things. Knowing what you're going to build and what you need 4, 5, 6, 7 years down the road can have tremendous savings and impact on the way you approach land acquisition, especially around right-of-way for projects. Knowing that you have something 5 or 6 years out in the distance might let you pick up parcels as they become available, as rates are favorable and opportunities come up, even if it's for just land banking things. Shutdowns are also pretty critical. I have seen a lot of towns that don't necessarily plan out when a facility is coming online and what that means to their service delivery. Do they have good plans in place for offering service at alternate locations, advertising things in advance so that they know that they're going to have services delivered in a different way for some period of time? So I think that ability to mitigate those service disruptions and to better plan for downtime is a critical piece. I think one of the biggest pieces is a good capital planning document really lets you get out early and often and communicate why you are doing something. You know, it's not uncommon in smaller towns really to focus just on what's happening this year. And it's especially with asset replacement, waiting until something breaks, knowing that, you know, hey, something is on fire, we have to deal with it now. If you get out early and you start putting things on the radar years in advance, you can really hammer home that why and get early buy-in. And in complement to that early buy-in also really lets you address the opposition early. You know, find out what the criticisms are going to be years in advance so that you can start having a plan to deal with those criticisms and the opposition to potential projects with enough warning and to develop a good plan around kind of the communications around that. And in particular out here, we have seen in the last several years a big push for regional cooperation and participation around not just projects, physical projects on buildings and facilities, but also with equipment. So, you know, when you have a few towns that have actually actively engaged in asset replacement plans over longer periods of time, smaller towns, they have an opportunity to look at service sharing and know what another town might be in need of, where they could partner up and build something better, cut their costs, share equipment, which is always a big one up here, especially seasonal types of equipment and rarely used pieces. So having that level of communication and transparency is pretty helpful if you think long term and you have enough towns that are thinking long term around you. So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach capital planning. It's important to recognize the limitations, especially in smaller towns where you may not have the staff to take on a lot of things. So one of the things we've shifted our approach to in doing capital planning and CIP documents for towns is really boil it down to the core pieces. You know, keep it very simple and take a very baby step approach and really encourage towns to focus on the foundational pieces. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we consider the foundations of good capital planning, because those are things that really need to be in place before you start or as you're starting a capital planning effort. You're going to have to do these things anyway. They're nice bite-sized pieces that you can do to get yourself prepared to do it. But it really lets you break it out and approach it over a methodical approach over a number of years and get yourself well positioned for successful capital planning. Leveraging the community. A best practice, and this is out of GFOA also, is establish a capital planning committee. Most towns have that in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes it is ad hoc and project specific, you know, building commissions or building committees, things of that nature, and specific task forces. But really, a capital planning committee should be a standing committee of volunteers in the community with a staff liaison, with some level of you know, a governor to put the brakes on things and keep things within budget and within reality. But that capital planning committee is a really useful tool that most of our small towns, if they don't have it when we get in to do a CIP, they typically leave with that committee being formed by their governing body. For very small towns, we've actually seen successful use of volunteer programs. They have a pretty good senior tax work-off program in Massachusetts. And we have used those people to, you know, go back through paper files and gather information on assets and do audits of buildings. You know, with a little bit of training, you can get some good utility out of those types of programs. So we encourage you to think about, you know, find the resources where you have them. And, you know, last, and that's what we do is bring in outside help. Obviously that comes with some funding challenges. You've got to have the funds to do it. You know, doing a full-blown CIP for us can be costly, but it doesn't necessarily have to be scaled up to the same level that you would see in a mid-sized community or anything larger. The one thing I would say is if you are looking at bringing in outside help, whether it's an entity like us or a private outside firm, make sure it's right-sized, because the least valuable plan you can get is one that you don't have the capacity to update and keep active. So even if that means that you do just the bare bones, keep something that is realistic for your staff and your capital planning committee to keep updated on an annual basis. Long-term capital planning is an annual process. You're rolling off that first year, picking up the new year every time you do it. And it's very important that you don't get stuck with a report that is just absolutely overwhelming for your people to handle. The foundation pieces are really a critical piece also. And these are things that may not be in place in a lot of towns, especially smaller communities, but they need to be before you embark on trying to do a multi-year capital plan if you want it to be successful. For us, one of the first questions that we will ask when we're talking about a town, about an engagement for capital planning is where are your financial policies at? When's the last time they were updated? Who manages them? And we do a review of those policies because there's a number of pieces in the financial policies that I'll talk about in just a minute that really should be driving your capital planning process, and provide a lot of the guardrails and a lot of the parameters under which you do your ultimate capital planning, how you phase out assets, et cetera. The other really important piece, and we'll often do this as the first step to a CIP project, if we do multiple projects for a town, is a good financial forecast. And these can be as complex as they need to be relatively accurate in the first few years of a multi-year forecast. I mean, it's anybody's guess whether your final years are as accurate as your first few, but you should be in the ballpark with a financial forecast, both on the revenue side and the expenditure side, of knowing really where you're going to be 2 or 3 years down the road to give you that ability to say, these are the resources that we would have available. Within that financial forecasting, another big piece, and this may or may not be applicable to all of you, but really what is your debt management policy? What are your debt management forecasts? How does that debt structure out over the years? And where are the opportunities to use debt as a tool to bring new assets into your operation, to replace things on a better schedule? And that financial forecasting piece really is a critical piece of that. So those first 3 things all really drive the capital investment strategy. And I'll show you an example of a very simplified strategy for a smaller town that we use. Really what it boils down to is kind of 2 pieces. What is your threshold for investment? Are you targeting a certain amount of your general fund for capital on an annual basis? Has that been consistent over the years? So it does take a little bit of a look back to see, what have we done in the past? Is that sustainable? Is that a method that has kept our assets in good condition? And how does that look kind of moving into the future? That also includes, what is our debt picture? How are we using enterprise funds? How are we using one-time revenues? One big thing that in Massachusetts over the last few years that towns have struggled with is really writing plans around one-time revenues associated with really 2 big changes over the last several years. One has been cannabis. There have been a lot of host municipality agreements that have injected a fair amount of cash into towns. Some of that's in the courts right now. We'll see how that stacks out. But you've got to have a strategy and policies around dealing with one-time revenues. And solar farms would be another big piece that has been an issue here in Massachusetts over the last few years. So all that factors into that capital investment strategy, which really boils down to how much are you going to have on an annual basis to put towards capital. And then when you stack that up against the next piece, that needs assessment, is it sufficient to meet what your needs are? So most towns to some degree have the next piece, which is that a really good inventory of your assets. Often it's scattered all over the place. And when we'll talk with finance personnel, when we'll talk with town administrators, we don't often find that they have a good grasp of where their different inventories are on their different items. And who's owning all of those assets and who's keeping up with everything. But that comprehensive asset inventory can be a pretty time-consuming process, but it's one you can really start at any point. But if you don't have it in hand before starting a capital improvement plan, then you're really at a disadvantage. So that is a big piece. The needs assessment varies town to town. It can be really a review of the items that are kind of coming out of that capital asset inventory. But more than likely, this is going to emanate from existing plans, things that are floating out there now that have identified some type of capital plan associated with a community goal years into the future. We want to have better playgrounds down the road. Well, that's got to manifest itself somewhere in a capital plan. The other big piece that we see is critical, especially in communities that are going to rely on voter support, is that community engagement and being very transparent about the project and future projects and how your plan lays out, how it's going to be paid for. And I'll spend a bit of time talking about that towards the end, because that buy-in and that community engagement are really key pieces of any part of the capital planning process. So it's worth talking a lot, I think, about the financial policies, because they answer a lot of the questions about how you are going to structure your capital plan moving forward. They're going to provide you really all of your guidelines, your guardrails for what are we targeting for available spending, how are we defining our capital assets, what are we targeting for our reserves? Do we have policies around enterprise funds? Do we have policies around stabilization funds or other one-time or revenue surpluses from prior year? Do we have policies that govern how that money is used, and in particular, how it's used for capital and one-time expenditures? Special revenues. I mentioned the cannabis issue. That was a huge issue that we've had over the years in Alabama. The other piece that virtually all communities have been struggling with lately has been the ARPA funds. What are the policies around those types of cash injections into your revenue stream? And do you have a way to separate those from one-time and recurring expenses? Because what you don't want to do is get into a situation where you're using one-time revenues to prop up operating. Not only is that just bad practice, but that really limits your opportunity for capital investment down the road. CIP policies as a subset of those financial policies are also critical. You've got to have a definition of, what is a capital project for our community, and that can vary. I mean, we've had policies that have thresholds as low as 5,000, and lifespans in the 3 to 5 year range. We've had other communities where they don't really consider something a capital expenditure until it hits 50,000. So having that fit your community and having that clearly defined in your CIP policies, in your financial policies overall, is really important. It's important, at least in the most general sense, to also have some process that can drive your capital planning process embedded and memorialized in those policies. So whether you're getting into scoring methodologies, or committee votes or rankings, or even putting things to public discussion, those things have to be memorialized in financial policies, and you have to follow them. Obviously, part of your financial policy is always going to include debt management, and how you finance, and more importantly, when you finance. What are your thresholds for financing? Are you tying the terms of financing to the lifespan of assets? Are you trying to reach some type of ratio with both ending fund balances or unassigned fund balances, or lifespan, or any of these other pieces that are out there? And then ultimately, it's going to boil down to, what is your target annual capital investment? The most important piece, though, is these policies. There are a lot of great templates and guidelines and model policies out there, from organizations, from other towns, and from the state. We have a really great resource here in Massachusetts through DLS on a lot of financial policies. Plus, every financial policy we've ever written for a town is part of the public record and out there. Uh, Cutting and pasting is great sometimes, but make sure that they fit your actual process. We do a fair amount of financial policy projects for towns, and the most important piece of that isn't us telling people what your policy should be. It's when we go through the interview process on the front end and find out what they actually do. And those are things that have kind of organically come about over the years based on their unique circumstances. And in most cases, they just require a little bit of tweaking, but we're looking to memorialize them and make sure those are one, available for guiding how you approach capital planning, but are very well suited to the way that your organization works. So always make sure that if you've got policies, even if you're stealing them from other towns, which I certainly encourage, that you've right-sized them for your particular situation. So just some examples, having debt service ratios on overall budget, how you're going to be handling your PAYGO capital budget, minimum amounts, maximum amounts for debt service, new growth, one-time revenues, discretionary projects, enterprise funds. This is an important one for any towns that operate any enterprise activities, whether through EMS or utilities. That their fee structure is accurate, and all these things should be part of your financial policies in really any community. So this is just an example, and I tried to pull stuff out of documents for towns that we've done that are on the smaller side, but this is a capital planning process and calendar that really draws directly from the financial policies. And, we've incorporated into a document and made it attractive and readable, but it is a policy-driven calendar. And this town, since they began this process, has been able to stick with that and to follow that calendar, and having that structure and having it really guided by policy is a critical piece. The financial forecasting can be it can be very challenging. It should be the foundation of your budget on an annual basis anyway. What you need to do when looking at long-term expenditures is obviously take that forecast out to match the term of your capital planning cycle, which typically is going to be in the 5 to 6 year range. Some towns have gone up to 10. I would scale how deep you go into your financial forecast with really what your staff can handle on an annual basis. What we will often do with financial forecasts is we'll actually come in and do a very detailed line item by line item revenue and expenditure forecast. And that is something that it would be a stretch to think a lot of our clients would be able to handle that on their own from scratch. So what we try to do is hand them a model and a structure for that model and a user guide with some training that they can then maintain year over year over year with really minimal effort. That's kind of our approach with financial forecasting, is go as deep into the weeds as we can, but make the end product something that is very useful for them. If you're doing something like this from scratch and you don't have the time or the resources to really spend on a lot of modeling in Excel, on really understanding each one of your revenue components, focus on the big buckets. Focus on a department level expenditure and just use historical trends and say, we're increasing 2.1% a year, extrapolate that out. You're looking to build the foundation for doing financial forecasting and to get it into the process for a CIP. So if you have to start small and you have to start with those bigger buckets, then do that, because that may be the only way that you are able to really move it forward and refine it over time. So obviously part of that is looking at that debt service model, pulling out your amortizations, putting them all on a spreadsheet, seeing how they all track out over a period of years, and when the capacities begin to open up, and then use your financial policies that dictate what your target debt service levels are, and have that drive your investments into the future. You know, you're backfilling debt as it rolls off. You're keeping a stable amount that's acceptable and appropriate for your particular town. Just a quick example, this is a smaller town, 1,800 people. This is kind of the summary view of a line item by line item projection, but they can be as simple as they need to be. We've done this for smaller towns and have seen them do this themselves, where they are just looking at what has their annual escalation been in each of these categories and pushing that out on an average basis over the 6-year period to get an idea. So it doesn't have to be highly complex. You just have to start it, and it has to be a foundation for your capital planning. Capital investment strategy, again, these can be as complex or as simple as they need to be. I would start simple, but this is your financial plan. This is your target of what you are going to shoot for capital investment amounts over the lifespan of your CIP. It again doesn't have to be highly complex. This is a really simple one that we did for the town of Blandford, about 1,200 people. They averaged a fairly high amount of capital expenditure. You can see about 9.3% over the year. We targeted, based on this, a target of 7%. So that gave us our threshold, the amount that they were going to target for capital spending and debt service related to capital acquisition moving into their CIP. So it was a very simple approach. It fit their town very well. It was an easy number to come up with, and it was very conservative. So it gave them flexibility as they move forward. One of the trickiest pieces is doing this comprehensive asset inventory. And often you'll find that your different department heads, or, you know, however you're organized, will have a lot of this information. So with certain towns, we've come in and gone building by building, inspected and inventoried major mechanical pieces of buildings, roof age, building envelope is a critical piece, especially in the Northeast. Flooring finishes and fixtures, those things have lifespans that industry standards are available out there for just about everything. You should know when you build something, well, more or less what year are we going to have to replace the carpet, and be able to get that on the radar, even if it's 10, 15, 20 years out. Vehicles and equipment. You have to have somewhere a good asset inventory of all your vehicles, the hours that are on them, the year, make, and model, general condition, repair history, those kinds of things. Infrastructure. It'll vary by what your town might be responsible for. But bridges, culverts, those are huge ones, especially as they impact transportation. If you list out a bridge, you know, that impacts a lot of other traffic patterns in the area. So you have to have a good handle on what you have. Typically, enterprise activities are pretty good at you know, having that good asset inventory, whether it's, you know, miles of pipe in the ground or poles for broadband. But having those inventories is really your starting point, because every single asset on there is going to have a lifespan, and that should give you an idea years into the future when a replacement or maintenance expense is going to be coming along. I put IT on there because most towns often forget about this as a significant capital expense. And it's not just the hardware and the servers and all the pieces that you have, but software, licensing, that sometimes can be a multi-year expense, where you will have, you know, every 3rd year you have to re-up a license, and it can be a considerable expense. The other thing on really any software is you should know what your end of life date is, and when you're going to have to start thinking about transitioning to a new piece of software, an updated piece of software, because anybody who's been through a software implementation process knows how, one, it's costly, but it's incredibly disruptive. And so you've got to have those things on the radar several years out so you can anticipate when they're coming. So all those things will give you a really good idea of what you've got, and how you have to maintain it, and when those big expenditures are going to be coming due for replacement. But the other part of the needs assessment is is what's on the horizon. What are the future things that are out there? Bunch of different ways to kind of go about this, and it depends what your town's history has been, what kind of plans you have in place. The place I typically like to start is asking the question, what other plans do you have? Do you have a master plan? Do you have parks plans? Do you have an ADA transition plan that might identify building issues that need to be dealt with? But gathering all those things up, going through them and identifying everything in them that's recommended, whether it's a wish list item or a nice to have or gotta have, those are asset expenditures that are probably going to have to occur at some point in the future. Get them on a list. It's not uncommon to have our CIPs get finished out and have a relatively small list of things in the first 6 years, and then a huge list of future and unfunded and TBD projects. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but you've got to get it on the radar so that you know these are out there. There's an expectation. We need to manage the expectation around these things, put them in the bigger picture context and say, you know, hey, if you want to do this new park, we've got all these other things that are critical that we have to take care of. That's a future discussion that we're going to have. Therefore, we're not putting it on our current plan, but it's got to be in there somewhere. Departmental request forms are always useful, depending on the size of your department, the complexity of the organization. We've had these things, you know, handwritten and submitted, but typically you're asking the department heads, hey, what do you need in the future? Doesn't mean you're going to get it. We just need to know what you need, how much you think it's going to cost, why you need it, and when you think you're going to need it, and we'll put it on the list. But starting to gather this information and keeping it up to date is important. You know, this was an internal one for Fleet, for a smaller town, about 2,000 people. This was never really something that they were looking to push out into the public discussion, but they wanted to get a better handle on their vehicle and their fleet replacement. So we had, as part of a CIP project, built them a fleet evaluation tool that they could use. Some of them can be much more complex and used for really the marketing side and the project management side. This was a town a little bit bigger, but we've used this model for some smaller towns where they really wanted, as an appendix to a CIP document, a good explanation and an attractive presentation for every single capital project they had out there, so that they could use them to communicate with the public and build on them over time. We had some of these that were submitted that were almost blank, that had nothing but a project name on it. That's fine. They filled it out a little bit more the next year. They got estimates the next year, and they kept building on it over time. But this was a simple tab in an Excel workbook that, you know, by the time they got it done, they had 50, 60 projects in there. They could move them around, move them up, and use them actually for management of those projects, so that when the select board asked, hey, what's the status of this sidewalk, they could go to the tab, they could figure out where it was, and they knew more or less how far out this thing is or what the status is. So this was an example that was really used also for project management, because they didn't have a good system for that. So that's another piece for the CIP, is the individual project information. This should be a management tool as well. So a lot of different ways that it can be approached. It can be as simple as it needs to be. Like I said, we've had these handwritten, we've had them come out in interview processes. The important thing is that you are getting the information from every possible source you have out there, so that you can at least get everything on a list, which, you know, that gives you your next problem. Now you've got this absolutely massive list of all these things that need to be done. We've gone into these projects with towns, depending on the level of complexity, and taken a number of different approaches. So sometimes their project list, it's like pulling teeth to get them to identify things. In those cases, they've got a relatively small asset load. They've got a relatively light inventory of infrastructure that needs to be cared for and maintained. So the decisions around how to prioritize something over a 6 or a 10-year period are relatively straightforward. You can use just a lot of common sense and move things around the spreadsheet and get a good idea of how do we make this fit within that capital investment strategy with a very simplified spreadsheet. When you have a lot of projects and you have to make a lot of decisions on how do things move into the immediate funding horizon and how do we identify funding sources, you're going to have to get a little bit more complex potentially and look at scoring systems, look at categorizing things by funding type, look at breaking things out by the different funds that they're in, making projects contingent on one-time revenues or grants funding receipt. And then obviously tying the funding source for restricted and dedicated funds to the specific assets that they might be restricted to. But ultimately, it comes down to especially for smaller communities, just some common sense and a relatively simple Excel model on how many things you have. You move them around year to year until you kind of figure out a way to make them work. I don't have an expectation that anybody's coming out of this conversation with an exact idea of how they would do that, but there's a lot of good resources for these scoring and categorization methodologies that you can find out here. I've thrown just a few. This is an example of a smaller town point scoring system that we did. So everything on here, we went through item by item, independently us, based on the descriptions that we got from the departments and assigned points to them. And that point system throws them into a prioritized list, which we then kind of work with the different years within the funding that's available to lay them out in a plan that makes sense. But it also gives you an idea of the critical pieces that are out there and the nice to haves, which sometimes need to be pushed out in deference to something that is much more critical. Maybe that might be a legal obligation or threat of imminent failure. For vehicles, we typically have a similar system. This was for a fleet specific CIP we did for a smaller community. And they generally didn't have a fleet evaluation system. So we simply built them a tool that they could use where annual inspections of the vehicles would drive a replacement structure. And it became very simple. They still use this today. This has been in place for about 5 years now, and they're still using this to prioritize the replacement of their vehicles over the years. And they've made a few tweaks to it, but it's been an effective tool for them. So once you have all this, then a lot of your conversation becomes, how are we going to communicate this out to the public, and how are we going to use this document to really be a communications tool? The important thing is that it serves an external purpose and an internal purpose. This has to be a document, however big or complex or simple it is, that is a management tool for your staff to look at capital acquisition, capital maintenance over time. So you've got a lot of flexibility in how you do that, but it also needs to be something that communicates to the outside and is used as a marketing device, is used as something that is easy to read, attractive, and useful for the public to understand why you're doing something. But it has to be done in a size and a scale that you can keep up with on an annual basis, because you have to recognize the need to make changes, update it for actual things that have happened, for new things that come up, and keep that level of transparency and communication out there, and use the document to do that. This was a very simple kind of the final end of a smaller community financial plan projection that we did. And so, we show very, very, very clearly what the future debt is going to be, how it fits into their current debt, how new debt replaces old debt, and then the amount of money that they have to set aside for capital reserve accounts to be able to kind of chip away at some of the nice to have things that are on there after they've acquired the gotta do items. Their CIP, this was actually 1 page of the total 2 pages that they had, where they laid all their things out. Very simple spreadsheet model, but it gave a very good idea of all the things that are coming down, and more importantly, how they were going to pay for them, so that they could discuss the expectations around certain projects that might be contingent on receipt of grants, for example, so that they could really work with those expectations and make sure they were accurate. The CIP document ultimately is about getting people to buy into projects and getting, approval to do what your staff and your elected officials need to do to maintain the assets of those towns. So it's about getting projects on the radar early, keeping them there, making sure there's discussion about them years in advance. Educate people on the inevitability of replacing certain things. Nothing lasts forever. So you have to have an understanding that when you buy a fire truck, in about 15 or 20 years, you're going to have to replace that thing. And, you've got a lot of opportunities with the document to communicate the costs. And I think more importantly is also the cost of not doing something. What are the opportunity costs? What are the level of service costs? Break those things out into cost per household. What is the actual impact of something? It looks a lot bigger when you're looking at the price tag, but when you see the annual cost and the level of service increase on a household basis, that might change people's perspective. And when they can see that laid out with everything else, it does tend to help get buy-in much earlier and get that opposition out of the way and those questions asked before you actually get to referendums around specific projects. It doesn't stop. Once you've started a project, you've got to be communicating throughout the full life cycle of a project, and that CIP document is a good place to do that. The value of pictures and tours, especially today, with the ability to do virtual tours and point out conditions in buildings, is absolutely, if it's not something you're doing now years in advance of needing to do a project, you need to really consider it, because oftentimes people do not have a good understanding of the conditions that their public sector workers are working in. I can remember the biggest project I ever had was a large public safety project, and everybody was on the fence until we toured a building and a fan fell down in the middle of that tour, right in the corner of a fire station. And that was the tipping point, letting people see the conditions of the facilities, even if it's several years in advance, having open houses, having public meetings, putting pictures out there, showing maintenance costs, making sure that you're putting pictures out there of things in their worst condition. That's an important thing for people to understand. And when you do something great, celebrate it. Open houses, touch of trucks, those kind of events, those are really important to get people to not have any second thoughts about the things that they let you do. You're making these investments for them, so take the opportunities really to get those things out there and celebrate when you have successes. So the communication cycle, the CIP document should be an opportunity to let you communicate the need for a project many, many years in advance and take you all the way through to the commissioning of that project, to the ribbon cutting or the open house around it, moving in day. So, that's kind of the life cycle of a project, and the CIP really gives you the ability and the medium in which to communicate that to people. So that's kind of the 10-cent tour. I really wanted to open it up to any questions or comments or hear about some of your experiences. I think you're muted, Michael.
There we go. Thank you very much, Michael. As we're waiting to see if there's any questions here, I did have a question. You spoke about the importance of the sort of capital planning committee that's potentially composed of volunteers, particularly in a small community. And I wondered if you could talk about the use of that committee and your experiences after the plan is complete. It's one thing to help identify priorities and resources, but then also to provide accountability in the future. It's one area we've observed to be important in successful capital plans, and wonder if you had experience on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good question, because I think when you're in a smaller to mid-sized community where you've got not just a heavy level of citizen engagement, but a need to rely on those volunteer boards and commissions, the best formats we typically see for them wind up being where you have, 1 to 2 dedicated staff personnel as liaisons and kind of coordinators for those committees. But also if you can, and sometimes this is taxing for volunteers, but if you can get a member of a finance or a select board, a finance committee or select board to participate on those, sometimes they can bring some experience into that type of committee. But they're, like you said, they're important in the identification, helping to wrap the justifications around projects. But in the follow-up, we've actually had several smaller communities where the primary responsibility on the document side and on the follow-up fell to that capital planning committee. They really were a capital committee more than just the planning side. They were involved in the document. They were cheerleaders on the projects. They coordinated the messaging around them. I think it depends on the town, but their role should be somewhat continuous. And if you have the type of volunteers and the willingness to engage where they're willing to have that year-round presence, that CIP process, a big piece of it is making sure that you're communicating throughout the lifespan of the project. So active things, they can be a conduit to communicate updates on projects to the public, to make sure things are hitting social media feeds and Twitter and pictures are out there, to inviting people to open houses. So it's not just in the run up to the budget, but where I've seen them be most effective is when they are actively engaged throughout the remainder of the year in building consensus and starting to look at those out years, because that's where there is, I think, the most opportunity to get that extra level of engagement and especially that public buy-in and answer a lot of those questions that come up over a lifespan.
One more question for me is, and that was extremely helpful, by the way, but the thing that also caught my attention and is very relevant to us is the incorporation of the hazard mitigation plan, particularly, post flooding here.
Yep.
And wonder if you had any good examples of how that's been done well. One of the challenges, obviously, having several plans and not having that capital component translate to where you put the money to work.
Well, I think, like I said, when I was kind of talking about those existing plans, that those hazard mitigation plans, climate adaptation plans, and all the other plans are really, that's your initial source for your needs assessment. That should be the first place you go. And there's a lot of communities that their hazard mitigation plans are severely out of date, or not necessarily up to the standard that you would hope. Those where you have a lot of different plans that offer a lot of different potential projects, that's where that scoring methodology can become very, very useful, because most of those things are going to score very high because they are, in a lot of cases, as you guys just saw, they're must-haves. Those kinds of things have to rise to the top of a community's investment ahead of, unfortunately, quality of life type projects, parks sometimes. There has to be some type of mechanism to push things that are either critical because of a threat, or legally mandated, or you're otherwise obligated to do those, up to the front. And if that means that something that's on the hazard mitigation plan needs to push something else out, that's where that multi-year planning has to be done, is because you really have to show, when you push something off to do something you've got to do, when's it going to fall into line? And obviously there's, you've got limitations in every region, whether it's contractor capacity. That was a huge one during COVID, is the lack of contractor capacity. Well, you've seen it when there's all of a sudden a big rush on projects around, excavation and concrete work and things of that nature. That puts a huge strain on the ability to do a lot of those must-do immediate projects. Having those things phased out lets you adapt to your contractor capacity in certain areas too. So that's a critical piece. Did that answer the question, Michael?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm not seeing any questions from the audience. So with that, I'd like to just thank you, Michael, so much for joining us today. For the audience and for those watching this on recording, I think we're going to be fortunate enough to see the Collins Center at the Bond Bank's now third annual Capital Planning Forum on Thursday, April 11th. Hopefully I have that date right. And more details coming from the Bond Bank on that. But thanks again to Mike, and we will post this on our website within the coming days. Thanks again.
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. And if anybody has any questions or wants to reach out to us, our contact information is here. You can find us on the web. But we're very interested in anything we can do to help, and always happy to have a conversation.
Yeah, and I
Thank
should
you again for your
mention
time.
for the local governments, just keep in mind the planning grant applications that are due November 1st can be used for capital planning. And then after that award is in place, folks like the Collins Center can help complete that work as desired. And so thanks again.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate the time.
Take care. Bye-bye.